Hello, and welcome back to Something in the Shadows. Today, we will be doing a mini documentary on Donald Pee-wee Gaskins. Like the video and subscribe to the channel for weekly serial killer videos. On March 13th of 1933, Donald Gaskins was born in Florence County, South Carolina. At a young age, Gaskins was teased and given the nickname Pee-wee as a result of his small body frame. Violence and ridicule followed him from his home where his stepfather beat him to his school where he fought with other kids daily. This would ultimately lead him to become the most prolific serial killer in South Carolina. At age 11, Gaskins quit school and began working on cars at a local garage. While working there, he met two boys, Danny and Marsh. They were all around the same age and out of school, so they teamed up and called themselves the Trouble Trio. The trio burglarized homes, picked up prostitutes, and even sometimes raped little boys. They would threaten the little boys so they wouldn't go to the police. Eventually, the trio broke up after they caught gang-raping Marsh's little sister. For punishment, the parents beat the boys until they bled. Danny and Marsh left the area shortly after that. Gaskins continued to burglarize homes alone. In 1946, a girl who knew Gaskins interrupted him while he was burglarizing her home. She struck him with an axe. He managed to get away from her, struck her in the head and arm before fleeing with the scene. Luckily, the girl survived the attack. Gaskins was arrested and convicted for assault with a deadly weapon and intent to kill. During the court proceedings, it was the first time he had heard his real name spoken in his whole life. He was sent to the South Carolina Industrial School for Boys until he turned 18. At a reform school, Gaskins was almost immediately attacked and raped due to his small stature. He spent time either accepting protection from the boss boy in exchange for sex or attempting to escape. Eventually, he escaped from the reform school and got on a traveling carnival. He married a 13-year-old girl. While there, he decided to return to the reform school and finish out his sentence. After he was released from reform school, he began working on a tobacco farm. There, he got involved in insurance fraud. He worked with a partner by collaborating with local tobacco farmers to burn their barns for a fee. Around the area, people began to wonder about the Gaskins' involvement in the barn fires. When his employer's daughter questioned him about the barn fires, he panicked and split the girl's skull with a hammer in hand. He received a 5-year sentence in prison for assault with a deadly weapon and attempted murder. While in prison, Gaskins committed his first murder attempt in an attempt to become Power Man. Power Men are the most brutal and feared inmates. Gaskins decided killing a fellow inmate would be enough to keep the other inmates from bothering him. He was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 6 months of solitary confinement, but he accomplished his goal of becoming Power Man. The newly found status made his life in prison more enjoyable. In 1955, his wife filed for divorce. Gaskins flipped and escaped from prison. Shortly thereafter, he remarried, but the second marriage only lasted 2 weeks. He then became involved with Betty Gates. The two went to Tennessee to bail out Gates' brother, but when Gaskins arrived back at the hotel, he was in for a surprise. He found out Gates' brother was actually her husband, and he had recently escaped. The police arrived at the hotel, and it didn't take them long to realize that he was an escaped convict. He was sent back to prison with an extra 9 months for aiding the escape of a prisoner. In 1962, Gaskins was arrested for the statutory rape of a 12-year-old girl, but he escaped to North Carolina in a stolen car. Once in NC, he met a 17-year-old girl whom he married. She eventually turned him into the police for statutory rape, and he received 6 years in Columbia Penitentiary. In November of 1968, he was paroled and made a vow to never return again. Throughout Gaskins' life, he describes feelings that forced him into criminal activity, which he referred to them as aggravated and bothersome feelings. In September of 1969, he found relief from those feelings. Gaskins picked up a female hitchhiker in North Carolina and became angry when she laughed at his sexual propositions. He beat her until she was unconscious. Gaskins raped, sodomized, and tortured her. Then he went to a swamp to sink her weighted body so she would drown. His process of rape, torture, and murder was described by Gaskins as a vision into the bothersome feelings he experienced throughout his entire life. Satisfying these feelings became the driving force in his life. He mastered the skill of torture, often keeping his injured victims alive for days. Sometimes he would cannibalize their severed body parts and either make them watch him eat them in the horror or make them join in the eating. Gaskins' preference on victim sex was slanted towards female victims. However, between 1969 and 1975, investigators discovered the remains of both murdered boys and girls along Carolina highways. No gender was immune. He considered these highway murders as weekend recreation. Killing his acquaintances were more serious murders. One murder, where he was close to the victim, included a 15-year-old niece and her friend. He lured the two girls to an abandoned house where he attempted to rape them, and upon failing to do so, he beat them to death. In his autobiography, Gaskins would claim upwards of 100 murders along the coastline. Although Gaskins had a reputation for being explosive, some people in the town just thought he was mentally disturbed. Most tried to avoid even being around him, but some people actually liked him and considered him as their friend. One of the people who considered Gaskins to be a friend was Doreen Dempsey, a mother of a 2-year-old baby girl, and was pregnant with her second child at the time of her death. She was leaving town and decided to get a ride to the bus station from her old friend. Gaskins took her to a wooded area where he raped and killed her, and then raped, sodomized, and killed her baby. He buried the two together. Gaskins was 42 years old in 1975 and had been killing steadily for the past 6 years. Up until then, he had worked alone, and that had helped him avoid being caught. However, after he murdered 3 people when their van broke down on the highway, he needed some help. He called up an ex-con, Walter Neely, to drive the victim's van to his garage so he could repaint and sell it. Gaskins was also hired as a hitman. That same year, Suzanne Kipper paid him $1,500 to kill her ex-boyfriend, Silas Yates. John Powell and John Owens handled the communication between Gaskins and Kipper concerning the arrangement of the murder. On February 12th of 1975, Diane Neely lured him out of the house by claiming to have car trouble. Gaskins then kidnapped and murdered Yates while Powell and Owens watched. All 3 helped bury him. Diane Neely and her boyfriend decided to blackmail Gaskins. They asked for $5,000 in hush money. Gaskins quickly got rid of them after he arranged a meeting for the payoff. Around the same time, Gaskins had tortured and killed other people he knew, such as Kim Gaskins, a 13-year-old who rejected him. 2 locals robbed Gaskins' repair shop without knowing about his bad side. He eventually killed and buried those 2 with other locals in his private cemetery. Once again, he called on Walter Neely to help him bury the 2 bodies. While there, Gaskins even showed Neely where he had buried other locals. After the disappearance of Kim Gaskins, the authorities began to become suspicious of Gaskins. After searching his apartment, they found clothing that had been worn by Gaskins. Gaskins was indicated for contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Neely cracked under pressure while waiting for the trial and showed the police Gaskins' private cemetery. In the cemetery, they found bodies of the following: Sellers, Judy, Howard, Diane Neely, Johnny Knight, Dennis Bellamy, Doreen Dempsey, and a child. On April 27th of 1976, Gaskins and Walter Neely were charged on 8 counts of murder. On May 24th of 1976, a jury convicted Gaskins of the murder of Dennis Bellamy, and he was sentenced to death. In an attempt to avoid additional death sentences, he confessed to 7 more murders. In November of 1976, the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional, so his death sentence was converted to life with 7 consecutive life sentences. In 1978, the death penalty was restored. This didn't mean anything to Gaskins until he was caught and found guilty for being paid to murder fellow prisoner Rudolph Tyner. The conviction caused him to receive a death sentence. He then began confessing for other murders to avoid the electric chair. If these confessions were true, then he would be the worst serial killer in South Carolina's history. He admitted to the murder of Peggy Catino, but prosecutors had already charged and sentenced William Pierce to life in prison for the murder. Gaskins' confession was rejected. Over the last months of his life, Gaskins worked with author Wilton Earl on his book, Final Truth. The book was published in 1993 and discussed the murders and the bothersome feelings Gaskins felt throughout his entire life. On the day of his execution, he cut his wrist in a last attempt to avoid the electric chair. However, that didn't work. Gaskins was placed in the electric chair with stitched arms and pronounced dead by electrocution on September 6, 1991. It is unknown as to how many murders Gaskins actually committed, since information was never provided for all of the bodies. Maybe he just wanted to be known as the most prolific serial killer in all of South Carolina. One thing we know for certain is that Donald Gaskins was a psychopath who had no regard for human life. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a horrifying day.